in addition to other towns?
Sorry.
No, that saves me from telling people that we're going to record the meeting tonight. Why don't I wait 6:33? Anybody has any questions or comments prior to us starting? Just raise your hand or speak out. Put something in the chat.
I see Fran's hand is up.
So I'm wondering what motivated people to come tonight. I could start because I'm interested in any way to reduce our impact on climate change, and food is a really important aspect, and everybody can do it.
It's easy. And it's not all or nothing.
Right.
I was recently at an event where people brought vegetarian food, and it was clear that people eat all sorts of things, where many of us are omnivores, but you can make a difference by making choices part of the time. So, Fran, it's good to have you here, and we'll have more opportunities in the discussion.
Okay. Welcome to LexCAN, Lexington Climate Action Network's monthly May meeting, which is called Food Matters: Why Climate Change May Hinge on What We Eat and How We Grow It. If you can continue to put your town in the chat, that would be great. LexCAN's mission is to educate the Lexington and broader community about the urgency of addressing climate change, to advocate for environmentally sustainable, equitable policies, and to act in collaboration with others to promote bold solutions that protect living systems. We're happy to have one of our partners here, Pam Tams from Lex Farm. We all work on this together, and I'm sure whether you're from Lexington or another town, you do that within your town. The first thing we're going to do is watch a video about 57 minutes long, put on by Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown's mission is to help the world stop climate change as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. We do this by advancing effective science-based climate solutions and strategies, fostering bold new climate leadership, and promoting new climate narratives and new voices. This is just one of many videos that they have. They talk about a lot of different issues regarding climate change. So while we're watching the video, feel free to put any thoughts or questions that you have while the movie's going on. Put them in the chat, and we'll address them either in the chat or during the post-movie discussion, which will be led by Marcia Jens, who's the chair of the LexCAN Programs Committee, and she will lead the discussion. So that is your cue, Marcia.
Here we go. Are you seeing?
Yep.
Great. Look at this. So here we will start it up. We catch at mid. There it is. All right. There you go.
Maybe thinking about that. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to have some time for discussion and Q&A. So should be a lot of fun. So let me share some slides, and let's from the soils of our croplands and pastures, because we're tilling them, we're plowing them up all the time. That breaks down organic matter in the soil, and we
Hang on.
fertilize many. And thanks to everybody who's joined so far. God, all over the world, it's fantastic. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who'll be watching this maybe later or recording. So today, we're going to talk a lot about the climate solutions we need to explore in the broader topic around food and agriculture and land use. And so I'm going to give a presentation for a while, kind of presenting some science and framework for maybe thinking about that. And then, of course, at the end, we're gonna have some time for discussion and Q&A, so should be a lot of fun. So let me share some slides and let's just go ahead and get started then. Okay. So we're going to be talking about the links between the food that we eat, the way farmers grow that food around the world, the land that we have to use to do that, and how all of this connects to climate change in our atmosphere and the future of our planet. So it's going to be some pretty heady stuff, connecting to the atmosphere, to our carbon cycle, climate change, all these kinds of big global abstract things. But at the end of the day, we do have to remember that food is very personal to all of us. We engage with it often, 2, 3, 4 times a day. And so food is very personal. It gets us emotionally charged and really, really sentimental about different things. And we're gonna have to work through some of that. And food touches everybody in the world in one way or another, either someone who eats, but also all the people in the world who produce food. And I think it's important to remember the people who really are the heroes of our food system, who work so hard to nourish and sustain not only the lands that they work on, but also all of us in our civilization. So today we're going to celebrate agriculture and food, but also look very hard at how we need to rethink the food system to make it a truly nourishing and sustainable future for the world. So food is not only touching us, it touches the whole world and transforms it. One of the incredible things about food is how much of the planet is devoted to the simple act of growing what we eat. And the history of agriculture has been one that has been associated with clearing enormous sums of land. Right now, agriculture uses about 35 to 40% of all the land on Earth. It's an extraordinary amount, and it's grown hugely in the last couple of centuries. And we know this. We can look at farms from an airplane as we fly over, or maybe from satellites, and see landscapes that are clearly devoted to agriculture and food all over the world, whether it's like the Midwestern US or Europe or Bolivia or rice paddies in Thailand or big soy farms in Brazil. Agriculture is touching landscapes everywhere in very different ways, but all with the same goal of growing plants to use for food or feed or biofuels, fiber, and other things. But if we step back even further and look at the whole Earth, one of the extraordinary things is how much of the Earth's land is used for food. For example, all of that green area you see on this map today, these are the world's croplands, areas that are growing the major crops of the world, like wheat and rice and corn and soybeans and carrots and blueberries and everything. Added together, if that was all in one place, that'd be the equivalent of about 16 million square kilometers of land. That's roughly the size of South America. We have a South America's worth of land on Earth today, just doing one thing, growing crops. An even larger area in the kind of tan and orange colors is used for grazing land. This is land that is just devoted to grazing animals. And that's 34 million square kilometers, or about the size of an Africa's worth of land. And put together, the croplands of the world and our pastures and rangelands are a total of 37% of all the land on Earth. This is extraordinary because just compared to cities, our cities and suburbs, all the land we complain about living in and driving through and whatever, that's less than 1% of Earth's land is basically all the people. But farms take up over 60 times more land than all the world's cities and suburbs combined. So to first order, the world's largest ecosystem is food, and nothing else that humans do comes close to that in terms of overall real estate. So 37% of the Earth's land is used for growing food. One of the remarkable things is how much of that 37%, how much of that area is devoted to one subcategory of food, animal agriculture. It turns out of all that land, the Africa and South America's worth of real estate devoted to food, 75% of that is used for animals, either for grazing them out in pastures and rangelands, or to grow crops that are in turn used as animal feed. For example, most of the corn and soybeans in North America are used for animal feed, so that land counts there too. So the biggest thing we do on the planet is food, and the biggest thing of that is raise animals or the food that they eat. So what does this mean? Well, we use a lot of land, but does it have consequences? Yeah, absolutely it does, because that land used to be doing something else. Clearing land for agriculture means that whatever was there before, whether it's a natural habitat like a rainforest or a savanna or something else, means that that land was replaced and cleared, and that habitat and the biological diversity, the species that once lived there, have now been wiped out or replaced with something else. And this is really important. For example, agriculture has already wiped out ecosystems like the North American prairie, the coastal Atlantic forest of Brazil, and many other ecosystems. But now it's responsible for clearing very critical ecosystems like tropical rainforest. And right now, rainforest, about a third of the world's tropical rainforest have been cleared primarily for agriculture. Whether it's beef or animal feed or palm oil, tropical forests are still under assault by being cleared for agricultural production. So agriculture has made a huge dent in the biodiversity and habitats available in the world's forest, our grasslands, savannas, and cerrados around the world, our freshwater ecosystems, and even coastal environments have all been heavily impacted by the land footprint of agriculture. So agriculture uses more land than anything else by far that humans have ever done. It is also the biggest user of water. So when we think about water, it turns out that humans have started to use an enormous amount of water by building dams and then diverting water for human use over the last century or so. And most of that water, over 70% of it, is used for just one thing: irrigating farmland. So we can see irrigation from space. We see how we suck water out of huge natural water flows like the Colorado River, the Agawa Aquifer, or Lake Chad in Africa. All of these are collapsing because we've taken water out of nature, spray it in the air to irrigate cropland, and then return that water back to nature. And the results can be catastrophic. For example, the Colorado River never even makes it to the ocean anymore. We see major water declines in groundwater in the US, in Africa, and here an example in the former Soviet Union, where irrigation has collapsed the Aral Sea, one of the largest inland seas in the world. The water that naturally fed the Aral Sea has now been diverted and used to irrigate the deserts of Kazakhstan to grow cotton. So water use around the world from agriculture is causing the collapse of critical freshwater resources and ecosystems all over the planet. So agriculture uses more land and more water than anything else we do, not even close. It's also unfortunately responsible for the biggest sources of pollution on the planet, especially for water pollution. And a lot of that comes from agricultural chemicals, including fertilizers. And fertilizers spiked after the 1960s through the advent of the so-called Green Revolution, where we started using more highly tuned crop varieties. We started using far more agricultural chemicals, fertilizers, and irrigation to grow more food per acre. Well, that has consequences. Using this much fertilizer means some of it runs off into our water supplies and heads out into rivers and lakes and eventually into the ocean. And when you add this much fertilizer to water, it has consequences. It's essentially adding Miracle-Gro to the world's lakes and rivers and estuaries, and causes algae blooms and collapsing aquatic ecosystems across many of the world's lakes and rivers and even coastal oceans, like the Gulf of Mexico that now has a huge dead zone caused by agricultural runoff. So agriculture not only uses more land and water than anything else in the world, it also produces more pollution, integrates water and ecosystems more than anything else we do. So this is a really, really scary kind of set of environmental impacts of our food system. And unfortunately, that's not all. Agriculture also contributes to climate change. And that's why we're here today, is talking about the links between food and climate. Now, normally, when you think about climate change, we think about fossil fuels, and we should. But it turns out, and I'll show you where exactly, it turns out, though, that agriculture is a contributor to the rising levels of greenhouse gases causing climate change, alongside our fossil fuel energies and industries and everything else. But when we see the rising levels of CO2, the rising levels of methane, and the rising levels of nitrous oxide, the three most important greenhouse gases causing climate change, we can see a very clear signature of agriculture, food, and land use, as well as energy in these curves. So we'll have to take a really hard look at this too. So I hope you can realize here how complicated food is. We definitely need a new approach to food, but it's one that needs to balance many different things at the same time. We need a food system that can provide nourishment and food security for the world across many different dimensions. We need to grow enough stuff. We need to make sure it turns into truly available food that's distributed and accessible fairly and equitably around the world, and is also resilient to economic and environmental shocks. So we have to think about all the things food does for us. But we also have to think about the environmental goals of the food system, how we can limit its greenhouse gas emissions, its impact on biodiversity, its unsustainable use of water, and its being a big source of water pollution. So we need to figure out how to balance this multidimensional picture. The problem is right now we have a food system that doesn't feed everyone and can't keep up with future demands, at least not right now. And it causes more environmental harm than about anything else we do. So how do we fix this? How do we grow more food? Make sure we're really producing food security and at the same time reduce dramatically the impact food and agriculture has on the environment. That's the job ahead of us, and how we fix this food system and feed a growing world without trashing the planet. Well, I'm convinced we can do this, and today we're going to consider one dimension of this problem, the links between climate change and the food system. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Again, when we think about climate change is caused by many things, fossil fuels being one of them, but it turns out that not only is producing electricity in our industry and transportation causing climate change, food and agriculture is one of the most important sectors. In fact, globally, when you look across the entire world, the direct emissions from food, agriculture, and land use to grow food is 22% of our greenhouse gas emissions right now. Well, what's under the hood? What makes up that 22%? Well, it includes many different things. It includes deforestation, methane from animals and rice, and farming practices. Let's walk through these individually. About half of the greenhouse gases coming from the larger food system comes from deforestation, clearing land, especially in tropical rainforest, mainly to grow food. I'll talk about this more later, but most of the deforestation in the world is to create land for animals, for beef in particular, or to grow animal feed, especially soybeans, or commodities like palm oil. So that's half right there, is just clearing land for more acreage. That we have to think about because it's the single biggest contributor. The next big one is one that we all joke about, is the methane that comes from animals, especially ruminant animals, animals that have evolved to digest things that you and I can't eat, like grass and forbs and things like this, and digest it in a very interesting set of chambered stomachs. And then they burp methane back out into the atmosphere as a consequence of their digestive system. This is a natural evolutionary trick that some animals have come up with, but now we have many more cattle being fed a lot more than any wild animals ever would have been. So methane levels from animals have gone up enormously since prehistoric times, and that's because of animal agriculture. And we have to think about that too. We also have to think about the sources of greenhouse gases from managed soils, from the soils of our croplands and pastures, because we're tilling them, we're plowing them up all the time. That breaks down organic matter in the soil. And we over-fertilize many of these, and that creates something called nitrous oxide that goes into the atmosphere. So we're kind of beating up the world's soils, and as a consequence, they're outgassing greenhouse gases. So we need to fix that too. Methane not only comes from animals, it also comes from rice, which is, kind of submerged in water year round. And we have to think about ways that we can grow rice without producing methane. And then we also have some greenhouse gases from a couple of other areas, including manure management and burning crop fields to reduce residues around the world. So that's kind of where the emissions of greenhouse gases come from agriculture, mainly deforestation, then animals, then soils, and a little bit from rice manure and biomass burning. Farmlands can also do a little bit of what we call carbon removal. And this is an area that's really pretty exciting. The idea that if we manage our farming landscapes differently, they could absorb carbon and put carbon back into soils and into biomass. This is an idea called regenerative agriculture. But right now, carbon removal on our farms is really tiny and removes less than 1/10 of 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, our farming systems are producing 22% of our greenhouse gases, about 200 times bigger. So right now, carbon removal is basically a round-off error compared to the emissions, and we'll have to think hard about this. Beyond the direct emissions of the food system, food also contributes to other kinds of emissions out there in the world. So I focused initially on this 22% that comes directly from growing food and farming and clearing land. That's really important. But it turns out food touches some of the other sectors as well. Like in electricity, we cook food, we cool food in refrigeration and cold chains around the world. We transport food, we also throw away food and it goes to landfills and often produces methane, which is counted in the industry sector. So when we look at all these kinds of emissions, we see directly the food system contributes 22% of the world's emissions. But when you add up everything else, especially food waste in landfills and refrigerating, transporting, cooking, processing, and packaging food, all that other stuff, that adds up to a total of 34%. So it turns out a whole third of our greenhouse gas emissions on the planet have something to do with food. Most of it is in growing the food itself. And we need to phase out these emissions. We can't ignore a third of the greenhouse gas problem and expect to solve climate change. Yes, the other 2/3 are mainly fossil fuels and industry, but a full third of climate change has something to do with food, and we've got to take that seriously. But the problem is, these emissions are not getting phased out. In fact, they're growing. Even in countries like the United States, where we're seeing real progress now on lowering our emissions of greenhouse gases in electricity and industry, and now buildings and transportation, food emissions are still climbing rapidly in the United States and most of the countries in the world. In fact, all the countries where we're seeing some progress on climate change, it's not happening in the food sector. It's mainly through electricity, and then later in buildings through heat pumps and electric vehicles and transportation. The food sector right now, those emissions are rising pretty much everywhere in the world, and no meaningful change is in sight. So we need a big reboot. A full third of the climate problem is not making progress and is tied up in food, and we have to think really hard of how to fix this. So how do we solve climate change in any sector? Well, first, we start by cutting the emissions. You know, if your bathtub's overflowing and pouring water out and destroying the floors of your house, the first thing we do is we turn off the taps. Then we get a sponge. But if you don't turn off the taps, if you don't cut the primary emissions from any economic sector, you're not going to stop climate change being caused by that economic sector. So we need to cut emissions in the food sector, first and foremost. And this is where they are, to remind you. Half of it is deforestation, then methane from animals, ruminants, soils, methane from rice, manure, and biomass burning. These are the direct emissions, and we can cut these dramatically if we follow cutting emissions along 4 key pillars. Well, what are those pillars? Well, the first one is the most obvious and turns out to be probably the largest. Maybe we can work on the demand side of the food system, like how much food do we need and what kind of food? Maybe we could start there. Just like we start with energy efficiency, and then we switch to renewables when it comes to decarbonizing the energy system. Same idea, how do we be more efficient with the food we already have? Well, the first and best place to start would be to cut food loss and waste. A lot of the world's food is never eaten. In fact, it's about 30 to 40% globally. That's extraordinary. 30 to 40% of the world's food that we work so hard to grow is never even eaten. In rich countries, a lot of the food loss and waste happens near the consumer, from the market and the supply chain to the restaurants to our homes and so on. That's where we lose a lot of the food. In poor countries, though, it's closer to the farmer because there's a lot of food loss in the supply chain. Maybe the truck didn't get to the road to where the farmer could get their food to market, or maybe the train broke down. Poor infrastructure sometimes means food is lost between the farm and the market. And there's therefore a double tragedy, the loss of food and the loss of income, often for very poor farmers. So when we think about tackling food waste around the world and see if we can tackle that 30 to 40% of food waste, what we can see as an environmental benefits of this is first, 30 to 40% of all the food and the emissions it took to grow that food weren't even necessary. But there's a huge upstream benefit of tackling food waste. That means 30 to 40% of the water we used to grow food wasn't necessary. 30 to 40% of the deforestation wasn't necessary. Fertilizers, not necessary, and so on. So there's huge upstream benefits of tackling food waste. We don't need to grow as much or pollute as much. And downstream, when we throw food away, a lot of times it goes into a landfill where it goes into an anaerobic, oxygen-free environment and produces methane as it breaks down. So food waste is a double win. You get upstream benefits from growing food that you didn't have to anymore. And downstream, you never threw it away to rot in a landfill ever. So this is a huge win for climate change, and food waste is the #1 solution when it comes to fixing food and climate change emissions. And it's near the top of the list no matter what you look at across all economic sectors. Food waste is a huge, huge issue. Another big issue is, unfortunately, our diets. And this is where we get into a little bit more nuanced conversation, and people get a little bit, a little passionate about this. And one of the reasons, though, it's so important is because of how much of our food system is devoted to doing different things. If we look at the world's food system, the green areas of the world are where we grow crops that produce human food, things that you and I would eat directly, like rice and wheat and fruits and vegetables and things like that that are grown on our farmland directly. The red areas of the world, especially the US and parts of Western Europe, Brazil, and Argentina, that you can see here, they're growing not food, but animal feed and biofuels. For example, if you drive across the Midwestern US, you see all this cornfield, every acre after acre after acre of cornfields. That corn isn't fed to people, it's being fed to cars and cows. And we then have to figure out how much of that turns into something we humans benefit from later. So it turns out around the world, only about 55% of all the crops that are grown are actually consumed by people. The rest of that of the 45%, that's being fed to animals and to automobiles. And when we do that, even though we feed the animals and we eat the animals later, we lose a lot of efficiency along the way. Because if we take 100 calories of crops, like 100 calories of corn or soybeans or something like that, we could turn that into 40 calories of milk, 22 calories of eggs, about 12 calories of chicken and 10 of pork, but only 3 calories of beef. It turns out beef is an extremely inefficient way to turn photosynthesis into food. Only 3% of the feed that we give animals in feedlots turns into edible calories, and only 5% of the protein that's in the plants turns into animal protein. It's an absurdly inefficient way to produce food for people. So that's why we get all hung up about beef and climate change, because it's so inefficient of taking resources from plants and turning it into food as a steak, for example. And globally, this has a huge impact. Again, crop production, about 55% is used directly as food, about 36% is animal feed, and about 9% is biofuels and other stuff. The animal feed does become food, but on average, depending what kind of animal it is, only about 10% of that becomes edible calories. And so for every 100 calories we grow, the world's food system only produces 59 calories. 55 of those are vegetables and fruits and grains, 4 are animal products. So the animal part of this is really inefficient. And when we look around the world, we can see the impacts of that inefficiency. For example, this is a map showing how many people could live off of every acre of land. Let's zoom into the United States. We see here that 16 people could be fed off of the corn belt of the Midwest, for example. But in reality, only about 5 people are being fed off of that land. It went from 16 to 5 because we're sending all that crop production not to be food, but to go into cars and into animals, where so much of that energy is lost. Other countries do a better job than the US and feed more people per acre than we do because more of what they're growing is actual human food, not mediated through an animal. So this is why animal agriculture matters so much, because only 59% of the crops we grow actually become food, and we still lose another 30 to 40% of that due to food waste. So even shifting diets a little bit, changing that 59% closer to 100%, could have huge consequences to the food systems. So that's why we talk a lot about eating less animal agriculture and eating a little more plant-rich diets, because it just introduces huge efficiencies back into our food system. Another area too, of course, is phasing out crop-based biofuels. In the US, I live in Minnesota, surrounded by ethanol production and corn, but that corn could be used so much more effectively. For every 100 acres of ethanol that we grow in the United States right now, we could retire 99 acres of that back to prairie and convert just 1 acre to solar panels used to plug into electric vehicles and still come out ahead in terms of saving gasoline in this country. That's how inefficient corn-based ethanol is in the US. Other countries have maybe more or less efficient biofuel schemes like Brazil and the Europeans and others. But crop-based biofuels could be phased out as well, especially as electric vehicles come online. And that could also reduce demands on the agricultural system and lower emissions dramatically. So food waste, diets, and biofuels have to be considered when we look at climate change and food. Another big area we have to think about is protecting natural ecosystems, especially rainforest, because we're clearing so much of our forests today for agriculture. The red areas and the yellow areas, especially in the tropics in this map, are places where agricultural forces are clearing land for more production. For example, on the edges of the Amazon in Brazil, we're seeing land being cleared for cattle, for grazing lands to grow more beef, or to grow more soybeans. And those soybeans are overwhelmingly used as animal feed. So animal agriculture is driving most of the deforestation of the Amazon. That's also true in some other parts of the world, but over in Indonesia, we see most of that deforestation as being linked to palm oil, a cooking oil that we use for so many different things around the world. So between beef and animal feed and palm oil, we're driving so much of the world's deforestation. One of the scientists at Project Drawdown, Paul West, showed how that could have consequences on climate change by mapping how much carbon we lose by tearing down these rainforests to get more agricultural land versus the food that we actually ultimately get. And he produced a really interesting little index, which I'm showing here. In the red areas, it means we're burning a lot of carbon in these forests and not getting a lot of food for it. It's a very poor trade-off. And so we can target areas for protection across the Amazon, the Congo, West Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, and archipelago, all of those regions to really target them for rainforest protection. In fact, one of the things that's so astonishing is between Brazil and Indonesia, just those two countries alone are half of the world's deforestation. Just two countries. And almost all of that is for beef, animal feed, and palm oil. So just a handful of countries and a handful of commodities, we can fix a lot of the deforestation emissions on the planet. Well, how do we do that? How do we curb deforestation? Well, it turns out there's a lot of great information out there now showing how indigenous communities, if we can support the land tenure and kind of land rights of indigenous communities in these countries, they take care of these forests in ways that others don't, and they hold on to them much longer with much richer biodiversity, more biomass, and much less deforestation. So working with indigenous communities seems to be the best way to protect these forests. Also, through international supply chains, we can have real transparency and obligations to not buy like soybeans that come from deforested land or beef that causes deforestation. How do we clean up supply chains that forces farmers and big commodity traders to not clear land to produce those same goods? And also people are talking about offset projects like carbon offsets that companies like to buy. And some of those involve maybe protecting rainforest. But lately, a lot of these have been called into question, whether they're really effective or not. I think they can be, maybe sometimes they aren't today, but could we have better offset projects where money's used to help protect forests for carbon and for biodiversity, but mainly supporting indigenous communities, having much more transparency and standards of the world's agricultural supply chains and international trade, and better next generation offset projects, we can protect these forests. And we need to. Again, rainforest clearing is half of the emissions of all the emissions coming from agriculture, and it's about 11% of the global total. To put that in comparison, the United States emits 10.5% of the world's emissions. Burning rainforest is 11%. It's more than the entire US economy, and we don't talk about it nearly enough. So preventing deforestation is a huge, huge deal. Well, what else can we do? We can also lower the emissions on the farms we still have. Once we reduce demand by cutting food waste, shifting diets, and phasing out biofuels, that helps. Once we protect rainforest, that helps too, but then we have the farms we have left. How do we lower the emissions on the farms that remain? Well, we have to look at several different areas. How do we lower emissions from the cattle that are still here? In addition to reducing the demand for meat and dairy around the world, which we have to do, how do we lower emissions from cattle we still raise, which will always be part of our food system? Are there additives? Are there breeding? Are there management techniques that can reduce emissions from cattle? Absolutely. And so there are ways we can reduce the methane emissions from this important livestock sector of the agricultural sectors of the world. Absolutely, we can do that. We can lower emissions from rice by changing the irrigation and fertilizer techniques of rice, managing them differently, dramatically cutting methane emissions for what is the most important crop in the world in terms of food security. We can also lower emissions from soils by maybe not tilling them as much, leaving residues in the soils in the winter, and maybe most importantly, changing our fertilizer use practices. James Gerber, another scientist here at Project Drawdown, has looked very carefully at this. And one of the things that's interesting about fertilizers, you can see in purple all the areas where we use a lot of fertilizer, the US, Europe, China, and India in particular. But it turns out fertilizers are kind of like the Goldilocks story we all heard as a kid. Some places use too much, like Shandong, China, uses way too much fertilizer for the yields they're getting. But some places like Western Ethiopia have too little. If we could boost the available nutrients in the soil in Ethiopia, you could get more yield. You could get more food, especially in a place where food is really in short supply. That would be great. Small uses of compost, manure, organic fertilizers, maybe a little bit of commercial fertilizer could grow more food in Ethiopia, but in China, we could cut it back. What if we went from these two extremes of too much and too little, and we went to Goldilocks and got it just right? Let's dial back the amount of fertilizers used in China, and let's dial it up a little bit in Ethiopia and find ways to get a more optimal use of fertilizers that gives you the most food for the least pollution. We can totally do that. And it turns out the excess fertilizers in the world are concentrated in a few places. It's concentrated in China, India, and the United States account for about 2/3 of the excess fertilizers used around the world, mostly for things in wheat, rice, and corn. Paul West had a paper out a few years ago that really highlighted these leverage points in fertilizer use. And we can identify quite clearly the regions of the world by cutting back on fertilizers in China, India, Western Europe, and the Midwestern US in particular. We could dramatically curb N2O emissions and water pollution without sacrificing any food at all. Other places could use a little bit more compost or manure, for example, and get a lot more food, but without much pollution. So getting a better fertilizer management will be crucial to feeding more people and dramatically reducing pollution from the soils. So we can clean up the food system in general by curbing our demands on food from food waste, diets, biofuels. We can protect rainforests and we can farm better. We can also clean up the other parts of the food system. For example, cleaning up our cooking. That's going to be very, very important. Refrigeration is a major part of this, and also transportation. These are all really important elements of the larger food system. Most important, though, is food waste going to landfills, and that hopefully will curb by reducing food waste as well. But when we put all this together, these four big pillars of cutting emissions really can do a lot. By curbing demands, by changing food waste, diets, and biofuels, we get this much. We can then protect rainforest and prevent this much carbon from going into the atmosphere. We can farm better on the remaining lands, and we can clean up the rest of the larger food system. These are all huge opportunities to cut emissions from the source in across our larger food system. And there are many, many opportunities to do this while boosting food production, nutrition, and farmer incomes around the world. There are some real win-wins here. Beyond cutting emissions, now we get to also talk about removing carbon from our working lands. And there are two different ways we can do that. First and foremost, probably the easiest way is to restore natural ecosystems, what we might call rewilding. By reducing the demands on the food system, if we get rid of food waste, and if we maybe change our diets a little, and we reduce the use of silly biofuels, we just spared a whole bunch of land that is no longer necessary for agricultural production. And we could put it back to wild nature. For example, we could restore huge areas of forest and woodlands around the world if we curb demands. We could restore grasslands and savannas across the world, peatlands, coastal ecosystems, and all of these incredible ecosystems, restoring wild areas, restoring biodiversity, and restoring the carbon they held from the atmosphere for so long. So that's the first way to do it, is through rewilding. Another way to go, though, is on the working lands we have left, the croplands and pastures that we still use for farming. And this is where the idea of so-called regenerative agriculture comes in. The idea that we could farm in ways that put back carbon onto the working lands, as well as the wild lands. But in this case, the working lands, regenerative agriculture could put carbon back to good soils through changing cropping practices, increasing agroforestry, putting trees back in the landscape, and managing the way animals graze in ways that can actually restore soil carbon and soil health by mimicking the behavior of large herds that might have been of wild animals in the past. And there's some great ideas here, because this kind of regenerative agriculture can build back soils and biomass, which has dramatic impacts on water quality and the ability of soils to hold water. That has a huge benefit right now for climate resilience. It helps withstand droughts and floods much better, making the soil more spongy and able to hold moisture far better than it does today. But there are some challenges of regenerative agriculture. First and foremost, it's a fairly limited amount of land that we could do this effectively for limited amounts of time. Also, some of these practices take up more land, like regenerative grazing, grass-fed grazing through holistic grazing, takes 2.5 times more land, produce the same amount of beef that, that conventional beef systems use today. So it would take up an enormous amount of land to grow all the world's animals this way. So we'd have to think about that pretty hard. The other thing is these effects tend to be temporary, that we can build up soils for a while, but they eventually kind of slow down and saturate how much carbon is held in a soil or in a tree or in biomass. And lastly, we have to worry about the so-called permanence of these solutions. Farmers today might farm regeneratively for a while. What about the next landowner, the person who inherits the land in the future? Will they just plow it up and change practices, throwing that carbon right back into the atmosphere? Or if we plant trees, how do we guarantee that those trees aren't cut down or burned down in the future? So we have to be very careful about these kinds of things and make sure we're not listening to too much hype. Unfortunately, regenerative agriculture has been very mixed with a lot of hype lately, where the rhetoric isn't matched by the data very well. It's still a great idea, but tone down the expectations a little bit, because the science is coming in now, and it's coming in a lot less than the initial enthusiastic hype that we all heard about regenerative. It's also running a risk of greenwashing. If we only do the regenerative building back the soils, but we ignore diets, we ignore food waste, we ignore deforestation, we ignore fertilizers, we can't possibly pencil out enough of solutions to stop climate change. In a way, it's similar to carbon capture is with fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry wants you to believe carbon capture will take care of everything, and we don't need to cut our fossil fuels. But we know that's not true. We have to cut fossil fuels dramatically first and rely on carbon capture as a distant second. Same thing with regenerative ag. We have to cut the emissions from our diets, from food waste, from deforestation and poor farming practices, and then rely on regenerative agriculture and rewilding as a secondary solution. So again, mostly like every other part of climate change, cutting emissions is never optional. That's always job number 1, 2, and 3. And not or, and we use carbon removal schemes, in this case using nature, in addition, but not instead of. So the approach that Drawdown is putting forward here is that we should look at 6 pillars of climate action in the food sector: cutting demands, protecting ecosystems, especially forest, farming better, fixing the rest of the food system, and rewilding and regenerative agriculture, and do them all together. We don't just pick one, we do all 6 full tilt simultaneously together and put together a really great portfolio of climate actions that not only reduces climate change from the food sector, it also increases food security, restores biodiversity, cleans water, restores water resources, and improves the world's nutrition. This could be a very good win-win set of solutions across the board for people and the planet today and tomorrow. So what have we learned in this little exercise today? Well, we've learned a couple of critical things, and we'll turn to questions in a second here. We've learned that food and agriculture and land use is a significant part of the climate problem. We know where the emissions are, mostly from deforestation and animal agriculture and bad farming practices. We need to address all those. We have a set of solutions that are here and ready to go today, but we have to think of a portfolio of them, mostly cutting emissions by curbing demands, protecting forests, farming better, etc., and removing carbon through rewilding and regenerative practices all at the same time. But making sure the top priority is cutting the emissions immediately from food waste, more sustainable diets, phasing out biofuels, protecting forest, low emissions farming, etc. And additionally, removing carbon through rewilding and regenerative practices all at the same time. Acknowledging carbon removal is inherently risky. It may not be permanent, and it can be used as greenwashing if we're not careful, but we should do it anyway. So next steps, what can we do next? Well, this year, starting right now, Project Drawdown is going to take a special look at the food system because it's been kind of the hardest one to solve of all the sectors contributing to climate change. We have great solutions now in electricity. We're starting to have great solutions in buildings like heat pumps. We're starting to have great solutions in transportation and industry, but in the food sector, we are way behind where we should be. And we're kind of dealing mostly in kind of hype and greenwashing rather than substantive solutions. So Drawdown is going to do a lot of work in the coming year, and you'll hear more very soon, where we're going to entirely rethink all of our solutions framework and come up with entirely new solutions and map them, not just giving you a global average number, but as you saw in this presentation, drill down to the specific pixel level, showing how these solutions would work all across the world using big data to guide us. Along the way, of course, we're going to try to engage key stakeholders who work in the food systems of the world and share everything we're doing with the broader world, like we're starting to today. And I hope that this has been helpful and really excites some interesting conversations. But looking forward, I think one of the things we're going to have to get really good at is learning how to collaborate better. This is a very thorny problem, and it's going to require all of us, people who produce food, the businesses that sell it and move it around the world, and all of us who eat it. We're going to have to rethink a really fundamental part of our society and the food system. And it's going to require collaboration, not confrontation. We're going to have to kind of put aside our initial kind of rhetoric and try to find constructive ways to collaborate that brings everybody on board and finds ways to get the food system to be better. And we need to be guided by evidence, not hype, not rhetoric, not what we see in social media necessarily, but what the science tells us is true. Let's be guided by data, not rhetoric. And we're going to have some big changes. And some of these are going to be hard, and these are some tricky waters ahead. But I'm actually really excited because we can start now and build the future we want. We can build a better food system that is more sustainable and performs so much better for the environment, of course, but also can feed more people more nourishing meals every day, provides better livelihoods for rural communities and farmers around the world, and does a better job of nourishing and sustaining the human population and civilization moving forward, and sustaining nature and our planetary systems. We can absolutely do both. I'm 100% convinced of this. We have the solutions in place to do this. But now it's time to get to work and implement and scale these solutions as quickly as we can. So with that, I'll stop here and
Hello, everyone. It's great to have folks here that are interested in how food and climate are related. I think that Drawdown did a great job of creating a framework for looking at all the different aspects of our food system and ways that can be improved and challenges. So I'm looking, and we are not there's not a really great number of us, so we could both do Q&A in the chat, and we could raise hands if you're visible and raise your hand with the raise hand function. We can kind of toggle back and forth between. I want to note that we have Pam Thames from Lex Farm, who is doing the work day to day of sustainable regenerative agriculture on a small scale that is biodiverse and serving our community and the larger Boston community. So thank you, Pam, for being here. I'd love to hear folks, and again, you can raise your hand or put questions in the chat.
Mark has his hand up.
Oh, thanks. I couldn't see that. Thank you. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
So it seemed like reducing food waste was perhaps the biggest bang for the buck. And so I'm wondering if anyone has some ideas on how that could be implemented in a way at a large scale. Or at a small scale, but, you know, replicated in a large way.
So I would say that there are at least two types of food waste that I heard him talk about. The waste that comes from farms or as a result of what's going on at farms, and then waste caused by individual people. I can tell you from Lex Farm's perspective that we waste as little food as we possibly can. We don't have an issue because most of the produce that we distribute to people comes from the farm. We are minimizing, that's one way of minimizing waste. Some of the produce that we get are from other local farms, and therefore it's not traveling a long distance. It's not out and about for a long time before it gets to individual people. And then the third thing that I would say is that we donate our surplus produce to local hunger relief organizations, Food Link, the Lexington Food Pantry, and Arlington Eats. So there again, we are trying our best to minimize waste. That's not to say that you would never come on the farm and see vegetables rotting on the vine. And I've heard this from people, you know, over and over again. You know, the farmers tell me that in order to produce for, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of people, you have to grow more than you will need because you know you're going to lose some because of the weather, because of pests, etc. So this is, I would say this is just one small example of what, I would encourage people to think of when they're thinking about where to buy their food from.
Mark, are you composting?
I'm using the compost service, so I'm not doing it right on my land, which is minimal, but it is like about, I think I don't know if it's like $60 every 6 months. I can't remember. It's through Newton. And if
Right.
enough people do it, they'll reduce the price. Yeah.
Right.
Mark, I applaud that, and we've had great success here with our curbside compost project through Black Earth. I think you may also use Black Earth, and the town has taken it up, and now we are moving to attempt to have 4,000 households doing free curbside composting through the town. So, and our school system is also composting their waste. So we're working on that one as well. So there's food waste, and then there's also food choices. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about, for instance, the Meatless Monday, or where you purchase your meat, etc. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I could just say something about something totally different, but
Yeah.
has been on my mind, is when you buy food that has an expiration date on it, especially with canned goods,
Yeah.
apparently there's no expiration date, that to have people understand what that actually means. And I'd love to see our food pantry, come up with a better process, because I think that this is my understanding anyhow, is that they're not allowed to put anything in the food pantry if it's beyond that quote expiration date.
Yes.
So, to clarify that would be really important, I think, because a lot of really good food just gets tossed because the
Mhm.
number on it, yeah.
Yeah, and they won't accept cans that are fully out of date. If it's close, there's an acceptance.
Mm.
I think they may have a special table for that, but I think that's almost illegal.
Well, yeah, yeah.
That we need to get some government oversight in terms of accepting that these are really very kind of unreasonable cutoff dates. Ricky has her hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering, because when we have gone to FoodLink, which is a organization in Arlington that collects food that is about to go out of date, and I thought some of it is actually out of date, like wrapped baked goods and things like that. And so when we have had events, they'll help nonprofits, and you can get cookies, and you don't want to take the real food from a food pantry, because that needs to go to the people who need food to eat. But they give away all of Whole Foods cookies that I thought they were out of date, but I could be wrong on that. And I was curious if anybody knew whether FoodLink takes those kinds of goods and then distributes them to organizations that need them.
Well, so cookies are an odd man out in a sense. It's baked goods that you need to put out fresh baked goods each day. And so they partner with different storefronts to say, okay, your day old bread, you aren't going to sell it, but we can take it and put it in our system to be distributed. Sweet things like cookies, I think that's easy for our group to get for events because they're not really wanting to send cookies out to the community, but they're trying to take
Right.
them out of the waste stream. But I think it's so important to have those channels that food that isn't fresh enough for the restaurant or the, storefront, but absolutely could be, enjoyed. I saw in the chat that another way we can address food waste is to use apps like Flash Foods and Too Good to Go, so the food gets eaten instead of throwing out. So there's ways we can, if everybody can check out that chat, it's, I think, helpful to try to take off the excess that's still good, too good to go. But I want to comment on our food choices. I'm a omnivore with I try to rotate through different food items in our home in terms of what we eat as our dinners. So eating meat, particularly beef, is a big deal. I still eat beef, but I think it's a really important thing to look at how much land is cleared for grazing, feeding cattle, wiping out tropical forests to grow soy to feed cows. I was so struck by the amount of corn in the Midwest, which is over fertilized and creates a lot of runoff, is also going to cows and also biofuels. And that's a political issue. The biofuels in the Farm Bill is really complicated.
Hmm.
Go ahead. Fran, you had a great.
Oh, I'm just, I'm just typing something in here. There's actually an app called Good to Go.
Yes.
Too good to go.
Too Good to Go. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Roseanne.
I'll change it. But they coordinate restaurants that have extra food and people who would like extra food at a discount. There are not a whole lot of places in Lexington, but there are a few. And it's just interesting to see what is available. So that
And
is,
it's more than restaurants. So there's a grocery store in Concord on there. Great Harvest Bread Company is on there in Concord. So bakeries are on there, whole bunch of places, pizza places.
I want to note.
And there's, sorry, one other thing, there's a Facebook, local Facebook group on it. So you can join that and you can figure out kind of what you're going to get in your bag sometimes before you try that place out. I didn't know that for a while.
That's cool. Put whatever you can in the
Okay,
chat.
I'll dig up the links.
And I appreciate you've already contributed, Roseanne. I wanted to make a shout out to Matthew Andrews about the plant-based treaty. I myself am not up to date on that, but it just came up at Sustainable Lexington meeting. I don't want to put you on the spot, Matt, but if you'd like, you could tell us more about that, or I appreciate you putting in the chat.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi. I have a 2-year-old screaming at me, so I can't really participate that much.
That's fantastic. Because the world we're trying to save is for them.
Yes, here he is. You got to save the world for this guy.
Oh my goodness.
Hi, cutie.
Thanks for coming. I
So,
think
but the plant-based treaty, it's a international campaign there's I think something called the Animal Save Movement, like out in the Midwest, and they seem to be like the initial sponsors of it. I don't know where they get their funding from, but they're super active. They do other animal welfare campaigns. They have a campaign against the farming of octopus, which is pretty incredible. But the plant-based treaty is the idea that, you know, we need public policy that promotes healthy, low-impact foods. You know, it's about promoting eating a plant-based diet and finding alternatives. You know, from the carbon perspective, also like water use, land use, that it's really good in it for a lot of reasons. And their goal is to try and get people to sign on either as individuals or businesses, and eventually build community groups that can try and get, you know, cities and towns to endorse the idea of the policy. And I think I'm not really up on like how it works, but I think their eventual goal is to try and get it through the UN or something like that, to try and get this to be actually taken up as you know, not just something to endorse as a good idea, but something to actually put into the force of law. So it's a very lofty campaign, but I think it's pretty exciting because, you know, I've been vegan for a long time, and I realize there are always a lot of limitations that when you try and tell people what to eat. But a lot of what we eat is actually dictated by just what's cheap and convenient, which is often the product of public policy, which is usually written because there's, you know, 2 senators out in Iowa that have nothing to do but support cows and cattle and corn, you know. So that's the big industry, and they get 2 senators, and then suddenly that's in the farm bill.
Yeah.
So we really have to take food policy back from the special interests.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you want to reach out to us and we can further that conversation, but it's wonderful to have you here with your little one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna mute myself because he's loud.
Ah.
He's throwing things.
I love it. I'm great links in the chat, and I'm
Marsh, I
hoping.
want to make sure you've seen Pam Bruno's comment in the chat.
Oh.
So I buy blueberries from
Okay.
Pam, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question, otherwise we can see it in the chat. And that's an interesting, I mean,
It's
such a balance. It's a balancing act. I don't know whether they plow down their trees for things like blueberries. I mostly see it for cows. You know, they go into the middle of the forest where nobody can see that they're burning down the forest because it's so massive. And that is for cattle grazing from what I've seen, but I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to. Does anybody in the group know the answer to that?
I know that there's a lot of discussion about transporting food, and there's, you know, discussion about how the transportation of food, for instance, from Peru is small relative to the other problems with food production. However, I think it's also how the blueberries are being produced, if they are being raised organically, or if they are in a kind of industrial agriculture model. My son happened to work in Ecuador in a strawberry field, and they were organic, but but he said it's not organic the way we think of organic, but it was just a little, you know, plot of land near a little river in a mountain community. So I think it's the devil's in the details, and that's part of the problem with when we're importing food. that we don't know a lot about where it's coming from and how the workers are treated. I think that's something to be looked at that I don't know. Anybody else have some thoughts? I know.
So I would,
I,
Pam.
one thing that I would say, and it's something that I've, heard the farmers say over and over again, I've seen it as a bumper sticker. Know your farmer, know your food. Um, there's something about that, sort of trusting relationship one has when you can see who is growing your food and how they're spending their time on the farm, and what they talk about is important. So
Agreed. And I think the local food movement, I just want to give a shout out, to Pam and to the farmers market here in Lexington, that you do get to talk to your farmer. You get to understand how they are raising their crops and their livestock, if they are indeed, for instance, producing meat and poultry and eggs. And I really value that in what we have over at Lex Farm. But it's asking those questions and trying to be to the degree we can, selective, and then think about, well, what, how much do we need? Can we do meatless Mondays? Can we look for locally sourced and organic or regeneratively grown food? I think those things really make a difference in the small sphere, which can have impact in the larger sphere. And then we have to look at food deserts and places where people don't have access to food. And I think that's one of the things that Lex Farm does beautifully, in terms of their collaboration with FoodLink. And I don't know, are you still doing the gleaners?
So
I don't know.
we did not use the gleaners last year, but for a good reason. We instituted a program 2 years ago, doing our own gleaning on a weekly basis. And so if you want to be part of reducing waste and getting food that's otherwise going to go bad, come on a Friday afternoon, and between mid-June and late September, and we will be gleaning whatever is surplus for that week. And then we bring it to the Lexington Food Pantry and Arlington Eats, depending upon how much we have. So
That's fantastic. I mean, that's
so
just.
can you explain what gleaning is?
sure. So it is harvesting what otherwise would go to waste, because the farmers have done all that they can do that week. They have harvested as much food as they could possibly harvest, and then they say, okay, we've done it. And at that point, they say to us, here are those cucumber, those cucumber plants we're not going to be able to harvest anymore. The eggplant we're not going to be able to harvest anymore. The zucchini, so you can have 10 of those plants. And we have been very fortunate to get volunteers, up to 8 volunteers on a Friday midday, working with our volunteer coordinator, knowing, where they're supposed to go in the field and how they're supposed to harvest, and harvesting that food. It's a form of harvesting the surplus.
It's fantastic. And I love that you put a plug in for Friday harvests. I don't know if folks have a lot of other questions this evening. That's great that we will save the chat. And with my fearless leader, Ricky, we will do some outreach, and Mary Yardley, to send things out to people who attended this evening and those who could not. I want to put in a plug for biodiversity. That one of the things I read today, and then, you know, we can either continue or close, was about monoculture farming. So giant industrial farming, which you have one crop and it provides food at one time for all of the little creatures, the pollinators. That means that the bees that are really happy when that one crop comes and fruits, or flowers, pardon me, then they starve after the monoculture's done. And a place like Lex Farm has a diverse crop system that's rotated and also is springing to life at different times. So that, I feel like, the biodiversity, we have a lot of additional topics to cover, and biodiversity is one that I think deserves a lot of attention. Roseanne.
It's not actually me. Ricky was raising her hand, so I just wanted to say so Ricky got to speak.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Roseanne. One thing I've always thought about, and I cannot claim to do this myself, but when I was growing up, I'm showing my age, you really couldn't buy cantaloupes in the winter because they were being grown in Mexico and nobody was doing that kind of transport of food.
Mm.
And you learn to either live with frozen fruits or, you know, apples, pears, the kinds of things we do tend to have in the winter. And I don't know whether that's kind of something we should all think about, like where, you know, Pam, what you said before, where is this being grown and what is put into getting it here? And maybe the occasional, you know, it's hard to go with without some of these fruits when you get so used to them. But that's one thing we can individually do in addition to Meatless Mondays, which is to try to think about the distance the food had to come. And of course, if we buy from Lex Farm or local farmers, we reduce that. I think, unfortunately, grass-fed beef grown in a way that is somewhat sustainable, more so than cattle, the kinds of industrial beef that's going on now, is more expensive, as is locally grown food. And when you don't, that creates a barrier for some people, and we need to not be creating barriers. So we need to be, I mean, this is really more of a policy question. We need to be supporting local farms who can provide local food to people at a reasonable price so that everybody can partake in better eating. The other thing that blows my mind that he did in the movie was that the amount of space we put for biofuels. You know, it's not necessary, you know, and it's so when the full transition happens, you know, and if we include biofuels as the transition away from fossil fuels, it will be really interesting to see how the lands get changed over to a more productive, enriching way and not a monoculture. So those were
Excellent. I saw that Fran put in the chat webinar on climate justice and farm bill. Fran, do you want to say a little bit about that link? And I encourage people to look at it because this is a political issue in terms of biofuels being a really key example. But go ahead, can you put that in there?
Yeah, so the Farm Bill was supposed to be reauthorized a while ago, but wasn't. And every 5 years, we have an opportunity to make things better. And this is a huge opportunity. I'm not sure with the current situation in Washington, whether it's going to get traction, but at least, you know, getting your position on this to our representative and senators, I think is really important. It involves what used to be called food stamps. I mean, it's everything from, you know, agriculture. You know, I don't know if it includes something on biofuels, it might, but I think it should be an interesting situation. Just closer to home, though, I would like to move more towards a plant-based diet, but I have found very few recipes that I just look forward to cooking and eating. So I'm just thinking, I know at Wilson Farm, they have some of these feasts in the field or something like that. And I just wondered if Pam, if there's anything like that, that, you know, could be done where, you know, you have a cook that is, you know, a great vegetarian cook that could use some of your produce and invite people in. You could make it a fundraiser, you know, that would be kind of fun. I'd come.
That's a great idea. We have had small versions of that, not as a fundraiser, but if we've had an open house, we've invited a chef to come and show off how some vegetables have been cooked. Keep in mind, we don't have a commercial kitchen, so it's a little more rustic. We also have partnered this year with a chef who works out of Stoneham, and she uses mostly locally sourced food. We've been offering these prepared meals, which are just to die for, once a month as a sort of a, let's see how this goes. Let's see, you know, what we could do. You know, we've gotten some interest. I need to find a way to get the word out to build more interest in that. So I love the fact that you're interested, Fran. And I'd be happy to talk to you offline about your ideas.
I want to add that that Lex Farm and the farmers market, both on their websites or newsletters perhaps, give recipes, you know, for produce that is in the basket. And I found that really helpful, you know, to say, well, what do you do with this? And they have recipes.
Right.
Roseanne has been patiently waiting.
So definitely on the, you know, if we can do less beef, I think, and when I say that, I mean like the meatless Mondays that you're referring to there, Marcia. I think it's also important to talk about eating less red meat, right? More lean meats. If I'm understanding, I think chickens and turkeys and all of that take up less emissions than beef. So, you know, just switching less of the beef and more of the leaner meats can make an impact as well.
Yeah, and I think that's all of these small choices, you know, it's not an all or nothing campaign. I think it's also really salient to think about, for instance, if you're getting soy-based products, where's that soy being grown? So where are things being grown? How much water, you know, I really appreciated the an analysis about water. So with the way Lex Farm is doing their farming, the swales are able to soak up more rain in a heavy rainstorm, and they're able to retain more of that moisture in a drought. So regenerative farming helps manage that. Ricky.
There was talk of, you know how we have labels on our food that tell us fats and carbohydrates. There was talk at some point of having on our labels how much water, sort of rating it on the climate scale, like how much water was used to produce this, how many emissions were used to produce this. And I don't know where that idea went. I feel like I heard about it a while ago, but in order for consumers to make informed decisions, we need information. Most people are not going to research every product and where it came from and how it got here, et cetera, et cetera. But if there was a way to do a better communication, I mean, it means embracing that everything we do has some impact on the climate, and if you want to decrease it, you're going to have to know what are the choices you're going to make, and you need some way to evaluate it. Obviously, we all know that burning fossil fuels to heat our homes causes emissions. That's easy, but food is much more complicated, and we can know that buying from Lex Farm is much better than buying from Stop and Shop in terms of knowing how it was grown, knowing how it was treated and not treated, etc. But I don't expect an answer to that question. But I think that the more information, the more informed we are, the better we can all make the kinds of decisions that may make a difference. I was in a webinar today. It was actually on the Arctic, but they dealt with a question that I thought was very interesting, which was making policy durable. And it talks about if for policy to be durable, it needs to be built from the ground up. And it's something we've heard many times from our representatives and senators that, if sort of the grassroots levels starts doing this, it grows, and then it's more community based, and then it becomes more state, and then, it just kind of flows up from the bottom. And it feels more stable, I think, because it's come from the bottom. We're not being told you need to do this, we're kind of involved in the how to do. So just throw that out there.
I think that's an excellent comment, and perhaps a great way to end, to think about, the groundswell that we can create, and capture, Fran's posts about the Farm Bill, think about, our individual eating habits, but also just thinking about ways we can share the good word, with recipes and encouragement, not judgment. I just so appreciate everybody who came this evening. And we will send out the link so you could rewatch this webinar. That Project Drawdown is just hoping to push this out, and they have a whole initiative on food and climate that's just coming online. I haven't researched that since it's brand new. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at last notes.
I wanted to make sure we save the chat. There's a lot of good
Wonderful
links in the chat, and I'm forgetting how to save the chat. Mary, are you saving the chat?
The
Thank
three
you.
dots at the
Oh,
top, if
Mary.
you click
Oh,
on
that's
that.
it. Okay, it used to be on the bottom.
They can't keep it the same. They got to keep you guessing.
That's
Right.
right. It's
I have
always
to update you.
always new. But thank you all so much for coming and sharing your ideas, and hopefully you can share this webinar. We will send that out to anyone who's registered, how you could show it to your own group and review it yourself. So thanks again.
Thank you for
Thank you, everyone.
hosting and facilitating
Thank you.
this.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Pam, for giving the Lex Farm local view, which is so wonderful. Appreciate it.
So I'm putting the link to that new drawdown food thing. It just
Oh.
came,
Thank you. It just dropped.
just came out. Yeah.
Yep,
Oh,
that's
wow.
great.
Okay. Great.
Thank you, Fran.